Glory to Jesus Christ. Today is Monday, January 30th, and this will be our third installment of our Bible study on the Gospels of the first 3 days of Holy Week. So this brings us now to the Bridegroom Matins of Holy Tuesday, which is served on Monday evening, April 10th at 6:30. So our Gospel that we'll hear at that Bridegroom service is Matthew 22:15 through chapter 23:39. So you can see that it's quite a long gospel. And what we won't do today is go through the full commentary from Theophylact, but really focus on chapter 23 and listen to the commentary about that. So again, this will be a little bit longer, but it will be fruitful. So pay attention to the words from the text themselves and then listen closely to the commentary from Theophylact. So Matthew 22:15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth, nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the person of men. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, Why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the tax money. So they brought him a denarius, and he said to them, Whose image and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. The same day the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses said that if a man dies having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were with us 7 brothers. The first died after he had married, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third, even to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had her. Jesus answered and said to them, You are mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. But concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, The son of David. He said to them, How then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him any more. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad, and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But you do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Do not call any one on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore he who swears by the altar swears by it and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore you are witnesses against yourselves, that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore indeed I send you prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So we'll begin in chapter 22 from Theophylact, from verse 15. And then when the Pharisees took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk, they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians. And Theophylact writes, what took place was a plot. Therefore Luke also calls them spies or waylayers sent secretly to set a trap for Christ. Herodians were either soldiers of Herod or those who thought Herod was the Christ. For since the princely line of Judah had failed when Herod, who was not of that line, became king, the Herodians thought that Herod himself was the Christ. So the Pharisees then, come with these men to set a trap for him. And then they address him with that question about the coin. And then verse 23 to 28. The same day came to him the Sadducees, who say that there is no resurrection, and asked him, saying, Master, Moses said, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife, and raise up seed unto his brother. Now there were with us 7, and the first, when he had married a wife, died, and having no offspring, left his wife unto his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third unto the 7th. And last of all the woman died also. Therefore in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the 7? For they all had her. And Theophylact writes, when the mouths of the Pharisees and the Herodians had been shut against the Sadducees, again the Sadducees put him to the test. Their heresy was this: they believed neither in a resurrection of the dead, nor in the existence of an immaterial spirit, nor in angels, and in general took a position opposite to that of the Pharisees. Here they contrive an impossible situation, for supposing that 2 brothers took her and then died, would not the third consider it an omen and refuse the marriage, learning from those who had preceded him? So the Sadducees invent a situation intending to perplex Christ and so to refute the resurrection. They even draw Moses as an advocate into their invention. They speak of 7 brothers so as to ridicule the mystery of the resurrection even more. Whose wife shall she be, they ask. One could answer, O foul Sadducees, she shall be the wife of him who first married her, if we concede that there is marriage in the resurrection, for the others are surrogates and not true and lawful husbands. And then I'm going to jump in to chapter 23. So the first verse of 23, then Jesus spoke to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not you in the manner of their works, for they say and do not. And Theophylact writes, when he has shut the mouths of the Pharisees and shown them to be incurably diseased, then he speaks about them. He speaks about their life and manner of living, admonishing his listeners not to despise their teachers, even if they have a corrupt life. At the same time, he shows that he is not in opposition to the law, but rather desires that the law be practiced, even those who teach it are unworthy. For he says, whatever the teachers say, you must treat as if it had been spoken by Moses, and indeed by God. Then should everything be done that they say, even if it is bad? We would answer, first, that a true teacher would never even dare to exhort someone to do evil. But then, supposing that there were someone encouraging an evil life, we would say that such a man is not from the seat of Moses, nor does he give utterances from the law. The Lord speaks of those sitting in the seat of Moses, that is, those who teach the law. Therefore, one must listen to those who teach something from the divine law, even if they themselves do not practice it. And then verses 4 and 5. For they bind heavy burdens, grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers, but all their works they do to be seen by men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. And Theophylact writes, the Pharisees laid heavy burdens on men, forcing them to fulfill the commandments of the law, which were detailed and difficult to observe. Indeed, they weighed them down with more than the commandments of the law, by handing down certain traditions that went beyond the law. These traditions they did not move with even one of their fingers, that is, they themselves did not practice them, nor even dare to undertake such burdens. For whenever a teacher not only teaches, but practices what he teaches, then he is seen to carry the burden and to labor along those who are taught. But when he gives me a load to carry, but himself practices nothing, then indeed he weighs me down, showing by what he himself neglects to do that is impossible to accomplish what he says. The Lord, therefore, is accusing the Pharisees of themselves not wanting to carry the weight of the commandments and to practice them. Not only do they not do anything good, but they pretend that they do good. Even if they had done something good because they did it for the sake of appearance, any gain they might have derived from it would have fallen from their fingers. So indeed they are worthy of condemnation now, since they do not do good, and yet they wish men to think that they do. What things do they practice? They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. What this means is this: in the law it is said, "You shall bind to your hand, and they shall be immovable before your eyes." So the Pharisees would inscribe on 2 pieces of leather the 10 commandments of the law, and they would attach one to their forehead and suspend the other from their right hand. They would make borders on the ends of their garments, consisting of blood-red threads like a fringe. For this too they found a text in the law, so that when they saw these things they would not forget the commandments of God. But God did not desire this. Rather, to have the phylactery upon the hand meant that one must labor in the commandments, and the blood-red fringe showed that we must be signed with the blood of Christ. But the Pharisees made large phylacteries and fringes, so that those who saw them would think that they were keepers of the law. And then verses 6 and 7. They love the place of honor at feasts, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and salutations in the markets, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. Alas, what is he saying, writes Theophylact? They are condemned even for loving these things. If he who only loves the place of honor is rebuked, what punishment does that man deserve who does everything to satisfy this love? In the very place where they ought to have taught others to be humble, that is, in the chief seats of the synagogues, there they themselves were corrupted. For they did everything for the sake of glory, and they were not ashamed of doing these things, but wished all the more for men to call out to them, Rabbi, Rabbi, which means teacher. And then in verses 8 through 12, but you do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And Theophylact writes, Christ does not prohibit one from being called teacher, but rather he prohibits the passionate desire to be so called, and the eager pursuit of every possible means to acquire the name. For the dignity of the office of teacher belongs chiefly to God alone. In saying, "Call no man your father," he is not prohibiting the honor given to parents, since he desires that we should honor our parents, and especially our spiritual fathers. Rather, he is inducing us to acknowledge the true Father, namely God, for he is chiefly and essentially our Father. Fathers in the flesh are not the authors of procreation, but rather servants and accessories, showing them what is to be gained by humility. He says that he who is great among you should be your servant and the least, for he who exalts himself, presuming to be something, shall be humbled and abandoned by God. And then verse 13, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. He calls them hypocrites for professing piety and doing nothing worthy of what they profess, but instead they would make pretense of long prayer and would devour the widow's means. And not only, he says, are you unbelievers who lead a corrupt life, but you teach others not to believe in me, and you corrupt them by your life and example. For the people are apt to become like their rulers, especially if they see them inclined towards evil. See, therefore, that woe is the regard of every teacher and ruler whose evil life obstructs others in progress towards good. And verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for For you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. And Theophylact writes, not only, he says, do you corrupt the Jews, but also those who come to the Jewish religion from idolatry. These were called proselytes. You are eager to convert someone to the Jewish way of life and to circumcision, but when they Judaize, they perish, corrupted by your wickedness. A son of Gehenna means he who deserves Gehenna and stands so close to it by disposition that he is kindled by its flames. And then verses 16 to 22. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore he who swears by the altar swears by it and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. Theophylact writes, he calls them blind for not wanting to teach what was right, but instead valuing what was of lesser importance and giving second place to that which was worthy of honor. For they valued the gold in the temple, the images of the cherubim and the golden urn, more highly than they did the temple itself. Therefore they taught the people that it was of no consequence to swear by the temple, and instead they taught them to swear by the gold which is in the temple. This gold, however, was precious precisely because it was in the temple. And the Pharisees said that the gifts placed on the altar were more valuable than the altar itself. So the Pharisees even taught that if someone swore by the golden vessel or the ox or the sheep brought for sacrifice and then broke his oath, he was sentenced to pay an equal amount. The Pharisees put a higher value on the gift upon the altar because of the profit they derived from sacrifices. And then verses 23 and 24. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Again, from Theophylact, he reproaches them as foolish for disdaining the greater commandments while demanding strict observance of the lesser, nor do they overlook a tenth part of the cumin, but tithe that as well. And if anyone accused the Pharisees of nitpicking, they would cite the law in their defense. It would have been better and more God-pleasing if they had required discernment and mercy and faith from the people. What is discernment? To do nothing unjust or unreasonable, but rather to do everything with good judgment and with reason. Mercy follows immediately upon discernment, for he who does all things with discernment knows to whom one ought to give alms. And faith follows mercy, for he who is merciful and gives alms has faith that he will lose nothing, but will receive everything. Or in another case, one must show mercy, but also believe in the true God. For there were many pagan Greeks who gave alms, but did not believe in the living God, and did not have faith that follows mercy. Every teacher, then, must tithe his people, that is, require from the 10 senses 5 bodily and 5 spiritual, the one tithe consisting of discernment, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done, the Lord said, not to exhort them to tithe herbs, but so that he not appear to be in opposition to Moses. He calls them blind guides, because by priding themselves in their teaching and extensive knowledge, they were of benefit to no one, but rather they corrupted everyone and cast them into the pit of unbelief. He says that they strain the gnat, meaning that they keep close guard over the slightest sin, while they swallow the camel, that is, they disregard the great sins. Then we're going to jump towards the end of it, verses 37 to 39. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And Theophylact writes, twice he says the name Jerusalem, pitying and calling out to her with compassion. For as a lover vehemently justifies himself to his beloved, intending to punish her for having spurned him, so Christ accuses Jerusalem of being a murderess. And many times he desired to show mercy to her, but she did not want it, but trusted in the devil, who scattered her and led her away from the truth which unites. And she did not accept the Lord, who gathers together. For there is nothing which disbands and scatters us from God so readily as does sin, just as there is nothing which gathers us back to God as readily as does a good conscience. He gave the example of the hen to show his affection. But as you do not want my affection, I leave the temple empty and abandoned. From this, let us learn that God inhabits the temples for our sake. But when we have forsaken God, then the temples are abandoned by God as well. Therefore, you shall not see me henceforth until the second coming. But then, willing or not, you will fall prostrate before him and say, Blessed is he that comes. Understand henceforth to mean after the crucifixion, and not at that time at which he was speaking these things. For they saw him many times after he said this, but after the crucifixion they did not see him, nor would they see him until the moment of his second coming. So a lot to take in on this particular gospel. Then also remember that there'll be a change of schedule next week, that we'll meet on Tuesday evening in person to discuss this at 7 o'clock instead of Wednesday, because we'll be having vigil on Wednesday for the feast of the meeting of the Lord in the temple. Glory to Jesus Christ.